struggles was that of human politicians. I take it that sounded familiar. Ever since, Dr. de Waal has drawn very interesting parallels between primate and human behavior, from peacemaking and morality to culture. His scientific articles have been published in hundreds of journals such as Science, Nature, Scientific American, and outlets specializing in animal behavior. His popular books, translated into many, many languages, have made him one of the world's most visible primatologists. His latest books are Our Inner Ape, published in 2005 by Riverhead, and The Age of Empathy, published in 2009 by the aptly named Harmony Books. Dr. de Waal is C.H. Candler Professor in Psychology in the Psychology Department of Emory University and Director of the Living Link Center at Yerkes National Primate Center in Atlanta in the United States. And if you haven't had an opportunity to visit the website of the Living Link Center, I would certainly encourage you to do that. It's a wonderful place to visit. Among his many honors, he's been elected to the National Academy of Sciences in the United States and the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences. In 2007, he was selected by Time magazine as one of the world's 100 most influential people today, and in 2011 by Discover as among 47 great minds of science. As SRA Conference Program Co-Chair, I'd like to briefly note that it was very important for us to invite Dr. de Waal for several reasons. First, we wanted to stretch our focus on adolescence by having an opportunity to hear from and speak with someone whose expertise, while not in adolescence, can nonetheless open up to new ideas and new perspectives for those of us who do work with adolescents. Second, the theme for this conference encompasses a focus on culture, and it seemed to us that in order to think about culture, we also need to think about its relation to biology and evolution. And then finally, Dr. de Waal, to my mind, speaks for a positive understanding and outreach across borders and boundaries. So if you look at the cover of his most recent book, The Age of Empathy, it shows a primate arm sort of on the one hand, and then a human arm on the other hand, and you have to imagine one of these being slightly more hairy than the other. And then the hands of the two arms are united in a handshake. And so for many years, Dr. de Waal has aimed to bridge this seeming gap between animals and humans, especially by highlighting the shared positives. More recently, he has expanded that message in the context of a globalizing world. In The Age of Empathy, he calls for more fellow feeling across boundaries and the stretching of empathic understanding across borders. And so in this sense, Dr. de Waal's work and message speaks to a central theme that is present at this conference. So we're very much looking forward to hearing Dr. de Waal's talk. In the spirit of having a lot of engagement at the conference, we're going to leave about 30 minutes at the end for questions and comments. So please join me in welcoming Dr. de Waal.
Good morning. I'm very happy to be here, even though I don't specifically work on adolescents. Primates, of course, have adolescents, all of them. A chimpanzee male, for example, is able to fertilize females at the age of 8. He's fully grown at the age of 16. So there's an enormous amount of time between the two. And for females, it's a bit shorter, but in fact, we females have what we call adolescent sterility. There's a period of time between, let's say, 9 and 12 or something, where they have a lot of sex, but they barely ever conceive. And if they conceive, they usually abort. So that's another period of adolescence. But I'm not going to be specifically talking about adolescence. I'm going to talk about animal behavior in general and primate behavior specifically. I'm a biologist, but I live in a psychology department, so I find that very interesting. The way psychologists, many of them, collect their information is in sort of one-on-one interviews or questionnaires. I'm not going to tell you how to do your work, just as you're probably not going to tell me how to do my work. But I'm so pleased that I work with animals who cannot fill out questionnaires, because they would be telling me all sorts of untruths, I think. And in addition, I think there's a lot of motives that we have and intentions that we have that don't surface into our consciousness. And so, for example, I speak sometimes for business leaders, and we talk about power struggles among chimpanzees and power struggles among humans. And I think there's an enormous amount. Also at this conference, for example, there's probably an enormous amount of power struggles going on without people even being fully aware of it. So, for example, most of my colleagues are extremely egalitarian. But in the faculty meetings that I observe, like a primatologist, there's a lot of power shuffling going on. And so even though they vow not to be interested in power, their behavior demonstrates that they absolutely are. So I would prefer, if I worked with adolescents, to work this way, work on kids in a group and see what they do. And I'm sure the motives are very similar to what I see in primates. The three main motives of interaction are sex, power, and affection. And I'm sure you're dealing with the same driving forces in all of adolescent behavior. So the topics I'm going to go over, and this is of course all based on observation or experimentation, are these topics: reconciliation, empathy, self-awareness. It's a long list. Pro-social tendencies, fairness, cooperation. And at the very end, I'm going to tell you something about bonobos. You may have heard about bonobos, but you've probably never seen much about bonobos, and I thought it would be interesting to tell you a little bit about them. As you may know, the bonobo is the favorite of the gay movement and the favorite of the feminist movement. It's a politically correct primate who has female dominance and a lot of sex, and I'll explain a little bit about that. So first, something about conflict resolution. That's actually how many of my studies started. I started with chimpanzee politics and power struggles, but in that same process of observation, I discovered that they make up after fights. And so here you have actually two male chimpanzees who have been in a fight. They end up in a tree. One of them reaches his hand to the other one and asks the other one for contact. And about a second after I took the picture, they came together in the fork of the tree and they kissed and embraced. And that's the reconciliation. And at the time, this was a totally unexpected behavior, because everything in animals, and including in humans, was explained in competitive terms. Everything is about winning or losing, and winning is always better than losing. Nothing was about repairing, which of course reconciliation is about. So reconciliation we usually define, this is the empirical definition that we use: friendly reunion between former opponents not long after a conflict. And the not long is only there for practical reasons. Humans reconcile sometimes after 10 years, sometimes after generations. And so there's no reason, in my opinion, why chimpanzees couldn't do the same. Not necessarily generations, but certainly there could be weeks or months between a fight and a reconciliation. But for practical reasons, we cannot really work with that. Stump-tailed monkeys, I do a lot of work on monkeys also. These are macaques. They have a particular ritual for reconciliation. This is called the hold bottom ritual. One of them presents, the other one holds the hips and inspects. And monkeys do most of these things without eye contact, which is a big difference with the apes and with humans. Basically, you are apes. You belong to the same family as chimpanzees and bonobos. And the apes cannot reconcile without eye contact. And the same way with you, if you would have a fight with your boss and go to his office and apologize and try to mend relationships, you would not feel reconciled if your boss keeps looking at his papers, for example, and doesn't look up. You would certainly not feel reconciled. But monkeys do it without eye contact. The way we usually study that is with the PC-MC method. So we look at a post-conflict observation and a matched control observation. I'm not going to explain all the details of this, but the PC, as you can see, and this is for stump-tailed monkeys, 50% of the time individuals get together in a friendly manner after a fight. That's a very high percentage. And in control periods where there's no fight, they do maybe 20 or 30%. And so that's the difference. It's exactly the opposite of what I learned as a student. What I learned in the textbooks, they said aggression drives individuals apart. Aggression is a dispersive mechanism, which is perfectly fine for territorial animals. But as you see, these monkeys, actually, aggression brings them together. And the same is true for chimpanzees, same is true now, we're found in many other species, same is true for many social animals, is that aggression brings individuals together. And that is partly because aggression needs to be followed up with something, otherwise relationships will fall apart. So this is how bonobos do it. They do everything with sex, so also reconciliation they do with sex. And in this case, of course, there's eye contact possible, and that's the same is true for chimpanzees. I'm going to show you a little video of bonobos. Let me explain. The easiest way to get sex among bonobos is to introduce food, because food induces competition. Competition needs to be resolved. They share food, after all, very well. And so food always induces sex among bonobos. So that's what you're going to see. This is at a sanctuary in Kinshasa, where there's a bunch of orphaned bonobos who live together. And here they're just sitting around, but now food will be introduced. You will see that. Here's the food and the sex. So they're eating and having, multitasking basically. They're eating and having sex at the same time. And that's how bonobos resolve these issues. But the principle, the principle is exactly the same in all the species, even though we may be distracted by how it is done. But the principle in all these species is that a disturbed relationship will be repaired. And this is such a radical idea, because if you look at how we thought in the 70s about animals, and including also about humans, as entirely competitive and aimed at winning versus losing, reconciliation doesn't make sense in that scheme. And reconciliation makes a lot of sense in a scheme where harmony needs to be maintained and cooperation needs to be maintained and so on. This is in children. There's a lot of child studies that followed the same scheme as we did with the monkeys and the apes. PCMC method basically exactly the same sort of data. It's culturally very variable. So some cultures do a lot more of reconciliation among the children and others do a lot less. For example, Japanese children reconcile very easily. We think, there's a little theory about it, we think it has to do with teacher intervention. In American schools, there's a lot of teacher intervention. As soon as there's a fight, it needs to be broken up. And the Japanese teachers, they stay completely out of it, unless kids kill each other, basically. And so teacher intervention, I don't think, promotes peacemaking skills among children. And so this is data on an American schoolyard. This is an actual human reconciliation. This is a photographer who acted like a primatologist and took pictures of McCain and Obama when Obama was still a senator. He had criticized a report by McCain, and McCain was very unhappy about it, and so they got into a fight for a month or so, and the photographer was present when they first met in the Senate, and they shook hands. And what I particularly like about this reconciliation is the facial expression on Obama, which is what I call compressed lips face. I know it from chimpanzee males. So chimpanzee males, for example, when they confront each other, they bluff at each other, they try to intimidate each other. The one who is retreating, the one who basically loses the confrontation, will have compressed lips where he puts air under the lips. It's a male expression. I've never seen it in females, and I think in humans it's also a male expression. And so in humans it's very common for politicians who are contrite, who regret something, who have lost a battle. So here you have some humans. So you remember Clinton, he had something to regret for sure. And so this is, and I always challenge my audience to send me pictures of female politicians doing the same, and I have never gotten one. Female politicians have tense lips when they lose something, but they don't compress air under it. So it's a very male expression that relates, I think, to dominance relationships. So now something on empathy. I do a lot of research on empathy, and as you may know, empathy is an up-and-coming field, also in human science and in neuroscience it's up-and-coming. And this is a sort of dictionary definition of empathy, is the ability to understand and share the feeling of another. And you see immediately the two components that it has. It has the understanding component, which is the cognitive one, and it has the feeling component, which is the emotional one. Now, psychologists very often go immediately for the cognitive side. And so for the psychologist, very often empathy is that you put yourself in the shoes of somebody else, which is a perspective-taking side. But there's also the emotional side, which I think is equally important. And the two are very closely intertwined. So you have sort of two channels to empathy. One is what I would call the body channel. And so that relates to synchrony, motor mimicry, emotional contagion. So if I talk with a sad person, I will adopt a sad body posture and a sad facial expression. These are all involuntary reactions which are very hard to suppress. You talk with a laughing person or a smiling person, you will be smiling most likely. So there's a lot of body mimicry going on, and that induces similar feelings in me as in the subject, and that induces then empathy. And that body channel is largely automated and is probably extremely old. Relates also probably to mirror neurons in our species. And so there's now some interesting neuroscience research going on that. And then you have the cognitive channel. And these two are closely interlocked normally, where you have the self-other distinction coming in. So now you're not just uniting your feelings with somebody else, you're drawing a line between them, and you're sort of saying, well, the source of my feelings is that individual. So you're starting to make that distinction, and that allows perspective taking, and that's a more complex process that is maybe more limited in the animal kingdom. So one way to study this synchronization is by looking at yawn contagion. Yawn contagion is very interesting. It's not exactly empathy. It's motor mimicry in a way, but it is an involuntary reflex. So it's not exactly imitation either. And it correlates with empathy. So people who have a lot of yawn contagion are more empathic. People who have trouble with empathy, such as, for example, autistic children, they yawn as much as other children, but they don't have yawn contagion. And so it relates to empathy to some degree. And so you can get these automated synchronizations. Here you see a chimpanzee who's watching. On the right is a real chimpanzee who's watching a computer screen on which we show these animations of a chimp who's yawning. So the chimp on the right, a male who's watching that. And so there are ways of getting at this synchronization process or motor mimicry process, and people have done this now with dogs, and you can try that actually at home. Dogs yawn when the owners yawn, at least if you have an empathic dog. If you may have the wrong dog, I don't know. Here you have a female looking at an iPod, at which we show videos of yawning chimps. So now the interesting part of this experiment is that it's looped here, so that you will see repeats of the video. These are actual videos of actual chimps, and on the left you see the bars there, the graph, where we have in-group and out-group. So on the very left is what happens when she sees videos of chimps that she knows, chimps who live in her group. And on the right are the out-group. These are chimps that she doesn't know. These are strangers. And as you see, the effect is actually basically absent for the out-group. And this is true for all empathy responses in both humans and animals that we have, is that it's an in-group phenomenon. It's biased towards individuals that you know, that you're close to. And more distant individuals, it's harder to get empathy for more distant individuals. And so this chimp shows a very clear in-group bias in her responses. Recently, a study on human yawn contagion was done in Italy through observations in waiting rooms and restaurants and stuff like that. And they found that yawn contagion works much more between individuals who are either married or in the same family than more distant individuals. This is neonatal imitation in a rhesus monkey baby. So the investigator opens his mouth multiple times at the baby, and the baby starts to make chewing movements. This is done by Pier Francesco Ferrari, who comes from the Parma lab in Italy, where mirror neurons were discovered. And what sometimes is forgotten, because mirror neurons have been hyped quite a bit at the moment, what sometimes is forgotten is that they were discovered not in humans, they were discovered in monkeys, like these macaques. And actually the evidence for mirror neurons is 10 times better for macaques than it is for humans, because in humans, single cell recording is very hard to do. And so we have a lot of this evidence, and it, of course, immediately raises the issue. If mirror neurons are involved in imitation and empathy, then very likely these same sort of processes happen in other animals. So more closely to imitation we're getting now is emotional contagion, where you're affected by the emotion of somebody else. This is an actual painting of emotional contagion between a girl and a dog, or between a dog and a girl. I don't know which direction this is going. But it's a mammalian characteristic. So the reason most of you have at home not iguanas or turtles or snakes, but dogs and cats, is because mammals have this capacity where we are sensitive to their emotions, they are sensitive to our emotions, and we appreciate that in an animal. An iguana is otherwise a perfectly fine animal to keep, but people don't do that. And so the study on rodents are now taking off. This is a mouse study. This is one of the first, this was published in Science with the word mouse and empathy in the title of the paper. And this was done in a pain laboratory in Montreal, where they had found that if you test mice on a pain stimulus out of a box, so you take them out of a box and you test them, the last mouse out of the box is more sensitive to pain than the first mouse out of the box. And they did not understand how this worked. And so they started testing it out systematically. What they found is it's based on vision. It's not based on hearing or olfaction or that kind of thing, so they could exclude that. It's based on vision. If a mouse sees another mouse in pain, it becomes more sensitive to pain. And it only works, and this is the in-group phenomenon again, it only works between mice who know each other. So if they see a stranger in pain, they're unaffected by it. So that's one of these emotional contagion papers that has come out, and now we're going to get into genetics of empathy, because the empathy responses of mice can be measured, and mice are it's much easier to do a breeding experiment with mice than with chimpanzees. And so that's the situation now. You should not be surprised that rodents have these responses, because the origin of empathy, most people now think, most people in the field at least think, is maternal care. Maternal care has provided the whole neural circuitry and physiology that is necessary for empathy responses. And all the mammals, whether you're a mouse or an elephant, the females need to pay attention to their offspring. The offspring are hungry or cold or in danger. They need to immediately respond to the emotions of the offspring. And so there's a high selection pressure, as we biologists would say, on showing the right responses. And empathy is very much a survival mechanism. And that would explain two things. Would explain why empathy is more developed in females than males, which certainly in humans has been found. Human developmental studies by Zahn, Waxler, and so on. And why oxytocin has an effect on empathy. If you spray oxytocin in the nostrils of men and women, you get more empathy out of them. Then recently there's the rat study that you may have heard about, which was done in Chicago by Peggy Mason's group. And what they did is they locked up a rat in a container, and another rat would learn over time. It was a complex process of learning to open a little door to get that rat out of it. And that rat would show, the locked up rat would show distress responses. And they went so far as to compete this situation with a box of chocolate. So they would make a container with chocolate chips in it. And they first demonstrated that rats are very keen on eating chocolate chips. And then they showed that in that situation, many rats actually opened still the container with the other rat before they would open the chocolate container, which they then would have to share with the other rat. And also in this study, females did more of it than males. So we're getting lots of more research on empathy, and also in birds, and I'm not going to go into all the details of this. So the cognitive channel, to say something about that, I'm not sure how big a role that plays in rats or mice, but it plays a role in other animals, has to do with the other orientation, has to do with drawing a line between your own feelings and somebody else's feelings. And that's also in human children, something that comes up later in development. And I think the same applies to phylogeny. So it correlates with mirror self-recognition. A German scientist, Doris Bischoff-Köhler, has spent basically a lifetime testing out children on their empathy responses, the complexity of their empathy responses, and their mirror self-recognition. And there's a very good connection between the two in development. And we think the same may apply to phylogeny. And so children, when they reach the age that they start to recognize themselves in the mirror, that's precisely the age at which they start to show more complex forms of empathy. And it has long ago been speculated that the same may apply to phylogeny. So we think apes are special. Apes recognize themselves in mirrors. Monkeys don't recognize themselves in mirrors. And apes show more complex responses in the empathy domain. So one of the most common ones the one that we actually study a lot, is consolation, where you have a chimpanzee who is screaming there, he has lost a fight, the adult male on the right, and a juvenile comes over and puts an arm around him and calms him down. And that's called consolation behavior. It's very similar to what you see in human consolation behavior. And so the first time I started working on empathy actually was consolation I knew existed. I knew that for a long time. But then one time I was at a meeting with child developmental psychologists who said, well, the way we study empathy is we instruct a family member to cry and say, I'm in pain and I'm sick and stuff like that, and then see how young children respond to them. And young children, already at 2 years of age, they go over and they touch them and they look at their face and all of this. They stroke them. I said, well, if that's empathy, then I have plenty of empathy in my chimpanzees, because there's a very common response. And it's a response that's absent in monkeys. It's sort of interesting. Monkeys have been tested in many different ways to get to this, observed, but we've never gotten that out of monkeys. So it's a really an ape behavior. This is a study that we did on 4,000 consolations among our chimpanzees at the Turkish Primate Center. I'm not going to go into the details of the graph, but the 4,000 indicates to you it's a very predictable behavior. It happens all the time, basically. If someone has been attacked and is sitting in the corner screaming, others will come over and put an arm around them and calm them down. And it's more done by female bystanders than by male bystanders. And so that's very similar to the findings of Zaan Waxler with children, that the girls do more of it than the boys. Now, more complex it gets with targeted helping. And targeted helping I define as helping that is geared to the specific situation of the other. So for targeted helping, you need to understand the situation of the other. The most famous case is on the left, upper left, is Binti Jua, is a gorilla female who saved a little boy in a zoo. But I'm not going to go into that. Let me tell you an example that I heard. There's many anecdotal examples. An example that I heard at a zoo in Sweden, where a juvenile chimpanzee was choking in a rope. He had caught himself twice in a rope, and he was basically choking to death. Humans could not interfere. You cannot just walk into a chimp group and do something. That's much too dangerous. So humans couldn't do anything. But the alpha male of the group went over to the juvenile and picked him up. So took the pressure off the rope and then unwrapped the rope like this from his neck. It's a very smart response, because if he had pulled at the rope or pulled at the juvenile, he would have killed it. So he did exactly the right thing under the circumstances, probably because he knew what ropes do and stuff like that. And that's what I call targeted helping. And my book, The Age of Empathy, is full of examples of that. But now recently we're starting to do experiments. This is an experiment that comes out of Japan, where you have one chimpanzee on the top there. That chimpanzee needs a tool for a particular situation, and the chimpanzee on the bottom here has a whole range of tools available. And so it's up to the chimpanzee at the bottom to hand the tool that the other one needs to the other, and make the right choice based on what the situation of the other is. And so there's now experiments on targeted helping, and targeted helping has recently been demonstrated in chimpanzees, which requires that you understand the specific situation of somebody else. So that's a more cognitive process than just emotional contagion. So to move from emotional contagion to targeted helping, you need to have a self-other distinction. You need to be able to draw a line between your own emotions and somebody else's, and your own situation and somebody else's, and that probably correlates with mirror self-recognition. And this is true for child development, and we think it's probably true for species evolution also. And Gordon Gallup, who is the pioneer of mirror self-recognition in primates, he already speculated 25 years ago that this would automatically mean that dolphins and elephants, who are very well known for being highly altruistic, should have a mirror self-recognition. We call that the co-emergence hypothesis, is that mirror self-recognition and complex forms of empathy come up together. Now, the dolphins have been tested and passed the test, but elephants had been tested too and had failed the mirror test. But the elephants had been tested, believe it or not, on a mirror of about this size. And so we thought that was not a good mirror for elephants. And so we built at the Bronx Zoo a elephant-proof mirror with a little camera in there. And I'm doing these studies with Josh Plotnick, and you will first see an image from this camera. Oh, no, I'm not going to show that, sorry. I'm going to show you the data on Happy the elephant. it's hard to see maybe in the distance, but on the left you have during the mark test, in the middle you have with the open mirror, and on the right with no mirror. And you can see that Happy touched her head quite a bit more during the mark test. So Happy passed the test, and the American media would say she's happy and she knows it. And now I'm going to show you a video that's brand new, so you're about the first audience to see this. This comes out of Thailand, where we're doing these experiments with Josh again. And this is a elephant named Pepsi. I'm from Atlanta. I'm always reluctant to pronounce the word Pepsi. But this is Pepsi, a 10-year-old bull, who has a cross on his head. On the other side, he has a sham mark, as we call it. Has the same substance, but without the coloring substance in it. So it's a sham mark, and you cannot see it. So Pepsi is put in front of a mirror. We are testing now 30 elephants in Thailand, and Pepsi did a very good job on this. So the cross is on his left side. So this is on a different day where we have put the cross on the right side. Now look what happens at the end. This is something that apes always do also. Look what happens here. He looks inside his mouth. And apes always do that because that's one part of their body they never get to see. And also apes, sort of funny, females always look at their behind. So the males don't. But for the females, the behind is a very important part. And they look at that too. For elephants, it's clearly not an important part. So the co-emergence hypothesis, I think, is supported, is that the animals with the most complex forms of empathy and altruism are also the animals that show mirror self-recognition. And then recently, John Allman, who studies a particular kind of brain cell, he added to this. So John Allman at Caltech, he studies these von economoneurons, which used to be called spindle cells. And first he found them only in humans. And he said, this is what makes us human, because if they disappear in certain forms of dementia, people lose their sense of humor, they lose their mirror self-recognition, they lose their empathy. And so he said, this is what makes us human. Then he found them in lower concentrations in the apes. And so now, all of a sudden, it was a hominoid specialty. And then more recently, they have looked at all the primates, and only the apes and humans show it. But then with Atiyah Hakim, he has looked at many more animals. And guess which other animals have it? It's elephants and dolphins, and not the others. And so now we have this perfect correlate of mirror self-recognition with a particular cell. I don't know what these cells do, and I don't think John knows what they do, but we have this correlate, which is very intriguing. So this is a question that we have asked many times over the last 10 to 15 years. Do chimpanzees care about the well-being or about the interests of others? And the answer used to be negative. So a sort of interesting story is in the last 3 decades of the previous millennium, let's say since the selfish gene has come out, everyone has talked about how humans and animals are totally selfish, totally competitive, totally selfish. Then around the year 2000, everything started to change. And especially psychologists and economists and anthropologists, they started to say, well, actually humans are much more cooperative than you would think. But they immediately attached to that conclusion that that means that humans are special, because of course all the other animals, they were still as selfish as ever. And then chimpanzees were tested frequently. They were tested at least 5 times in particular experiments where they did not show pro-social tendencies. And so that reinforced that conclusion that it was a uniquely human phenomenon. So there's a decade of negative results on chimps. These are some quotes from that literature. Chimpanzees are indifferent to the welfare of others. Chimpanzees make their choices based on personal gain. And so the chimpanzee was out, and it sort of elevated the human to a special status in that literature. But it is very hard to compare chimps with children in experiments. So that's the big problem that we run into. First of all, there's sometimes negative evidence, and I personally don't know what negative evidence means, but some people make big conclusions out of negative evidence. And then if you look at what kind of experiments it's based on, they superficially look very similar, but they are actually very different, in my opinion. So this is the typical situation on the left and on the right. So find the differences between these situations. The left is how you would test a child, and the right is how you would test a chimp. And superficially, you could say, yes, we're testing them in exactly the same way, and we found different results. First of all, there's language use. The child is being talked to, and you say, look at this and look at that. We've actually done recently experiments with children where we didn't give them any verbal instructions. We treated them exactly like chimpanzees, except we would talk about things that had nothing to do with the experiment, like, oh, you have a nice skirt on, or something like that. And the children actually do quite poorly if you don't give them any verbal instructions. So language use is one of them, and the chimps don't have benefit from that. There's a physical barrier in the case of chimpanzees, and so they are behind a barrier, and the children run around in the test room. There is parental influence, so the child sits on the lap of the parent. The chimpanzee is usually alone. You may think parental influence is not big, but people who test dogs, for example, I was recently in a dog laboratory, they bring in the owner with the dogs, because the dogs don't feel very well without the owner in the room, but they blindfold the owner and put them in the corner. That's a way of treating the owner, I think. And that's the way you should be treating your parents. Kick them out of the experiment somehow, or blindfold them, or something like that. And then the big difference, the really biggest difference, in my opinion, is that the child is tested by its own species, and the chimp is tested by another species. And we know from certain studies now that, for example, chimpanzees have trouble following the gaze of humans. They have no trouble following the gaze of chimpanzees. And basically, for a chimpanzee, a human, it would be like having children tested by apes, which is a hard thing to do, I think, but that would be the equal comparison, I think, between the two. So this is a very common setup nowadays, but I'm not sure what you can conclude from it. I think it's apples and oranges, basically. And so we have the tendency to test chimp to chimp. And so the human is in there as the experimenter, but we prefer to set up things between apes or between elephants and see what they do with each other. And this is our pro-social choice test. So a chimp on the right has a bucket with tokens, and the chimp on the left is the partner. And I'll show you a little video of how this works. So the chimps live in an outdoor area. This is actually the little window that you see on top there. That's my office window that overlooks the chimpanzees. And so here you have a little video of this. We have two colored tokens, a selfish token and a pro-social token. They're all mixed together in a bucket. And the chimp can make three choices. That's the partner sits behind mesh, so very close by. And there's a little table, as you saw, on the left through the window. So first this chimp makes a selfish choice, picks a red token, gives it to us. We accept it. We put it on the table to remind them of their choice. We feed only the chimp on the right. The chimp on the left walks away, is not very happy about the choice. You will see that. Is going to express her opinion about the choice. Now we get a pro-social choice. The chimp picks a green token. And again, we accept it and we put it on the table. We feed both chimps now. And we put tokens back into the bucket. So we, as you see in that little hole there, we want to keep the numbers of tokens exactly the same in the bucket. So this is the whole experiment. And we do this 30 times in a row. At the beginning of the experiments, the chimps don't know what the tokens mean. So they have learned, of course, to exchange for tokens. They know that part. But they don't know what the two colors do. And so you have to realize that the one who makes the choices, the one who grabs into the bucket, it doesn't make any difference to that chimp what she picks. She will always get rewarded. She always gets a reward for any pick that she makes. The only difference for her is, does my partner get some food, yes or no? That's the only difference that we're testing here. Now, these are the first results here. What you see on the left is none. It says when the partner doesn't do anything, is just sitting there, they make significantly pro-social choices. If the partner draws attention to itself by climbing around and looking at the other and maybe vocalizing or whatever it is, the choices go up to nearly 70%. If the partner puts pressure on them, starts spitting water or intimidating or hooting at them and doing nasty things, the choices go down. So basically the chooser is saying, well, if you're going to behave like this, I'm not going to do anything. So it's not that they do this under pressure. And I should say also that the most generous individuals in our study were the most dominant individuals who have least to fear. These chimps live normally together, so you could say maybe they fear repercussions or something, but it's actually the dominants who do more of this than the subordinates. And this is what happens when there's no partner on the other side. So we were the first to demonstrate that apes have pro-social tendencies in this kind of choice test, which is really not surprising if you know what chimps do in the field or in captive settings. From the field, we know, for example, that they defend each other against leopards. We know that male adopt orphans and carry them around for sometimes 5 years. There's actually a whole movie that is now playing in the theaters in the United States. It's called Chimpanzee, and it's all about altruistic behavior of male chimpanzees. And so we've known this for ages, but the experimenters somehow couldn't find it, and we have now recently demonstrated this. So something on cooperation and fairness. This is a very old video from the Yerkes Primate Center, which shows that already in the 1920s, we did experiments on cooperation at Yerkes. And it's an experiment that is keep being repeated, and we keep doing it. It's a fascinating experiment. These are two juvenile chimps who pulling on ropes attached to a box, and the box is too heavy for one chimp to get it in. And on the box is, of course, food, otherwise they wouldn't be pulling like this. It's very coordinated, so the synchronization is immediately visible. These are maybe 4 or 5 year old chimps. And already in that time, they were interested in more complex issues like recruitment. So now what they do is they give one chimp a lot of food, so that one chimp is not hungry anymore, and see what then happens. So now you have a differential. You have a differential of motivation now. So see what happens at the end. So the interesting part here is that the one on the right has a full understanding that he needs the partner. And the one on the left is willing to pull, even though he's not really interested in the food. Which probably relates to reciprocity between these two individuals. We do a lot of studies of reciprocity. It's very highly developed in chimpanzees. And so you see right here, sort of in a nutshell, the cooperative tendencies of chimpanzees, which I think are very highly developed. So we do that same experiment with elephants. Elephants are a very dangerous animal to work with, and it's very hard to do these experiments. And in addition, with elephants, it's very hard to make an apparatus that is too heavy for an elephant. So what we did in this case is we have an apparatus that there's a rope that runs around the whole thing. And so there's a single rope. So if you pull on this side of the rope, it disappears on the other side. And that means that 2 elephants have to pick up the rope at exactly the same time and pull at the same time. Otherwise, the test will not succeed. So that's what you're going to see in the first video. The first video is the simple part. is when we release 2 elephants at the same time and they arrive at an apparatus that is on the left. There's a rope running around it. You can barely see it, but the elephants are going to pick it up. And since they arrive at the same time, it's a very easy decision to start pulling at the same time. That's what they're going to do. So that's the first part, and then we're going to make it more difficult for them. Then we're going to release one elephant first, who has to wait for the other one, sometimes up to 45 seconds, and see if they will do that. Because if they don't wait and start pulling, then the test is over and nothing will happen. Now this elephant here on the bottom does something that is illegal that we didn't teach them to do. He puts his big foot on the rope and stands there and then waits for the other, and the other is going to do all the work for him. So that's what we call freeloading. But it shows the level of understanding, because our interest is how well do they understand this task. And we had several elephants who developed these alternative techniques that we didn't necessarily approve of, but which showed that they understood it perfectly well. So now the other elephant is coming. Yeah, so this test takes a little bit longer. Because all the pulling is done by this one. And notice what the other one does. The other one doesn't forget to eat, you see. There we go. So we found that elephants have as good an understanding, we think, because this test has now been done on many different animals, is as good as in apes. There's not a whole lot of animals who have this level of understanding of cooperation. Now the same test, this is with monkeys, with capuchin monkeys. We've done the same test in many different ways, and capuchin monkeys are very good cooperators. And in the process of doing this, we discovered that they are sensitive to the reward distribution. And so that if one of them gets a better reward than the other one is affected by that, which he shouldn't be. There's all these theories in economics that we are maximum profit, optimum profit maximizers. And normally you would think that a reward is good if it's better than nothing. But that's not what we found in the monkeys. And so with Sarah Brosnan, we started doing experiments on inequality between the monkeys. And I'm going to show you the original experiment with capuchin monkeys, because this has now been done with dogs and with birds and with chimpanzees. And it's all very interesting, but I think the original study is still the most interesting one. So here is what we do. We take a capuchin monkey and we give him a token. The token is a little rock. We hold up a hand. He has to give it back. As soon as he gives it back, he gets a little piece of cucumber, which is the reward. And the monkeys are perfectly fine doing this. Then we put 2 monkeys side by side. One gets still the pieces of cucumber. The other one now gets grapes. So what is the better reward? You're all primates. You all go for sugar content. And so grapes are better. Actually, the food preferences of my monkeys, they correspond precisely with the prices in the supermarket. And so this is the setup of the inequality. This is what we find. I'm going to show you a little video of this. But you see on the left a capuchin who returns the rock. You see the cuke-to-cuke situation. There's only 5% rejections, meaning 95% of the time, because we do this many times in a row, the monkeys will exchange without a problem if both of them get cucumber. So cucumber works very well for this experiment. If the partner gets a grape, they start to reject 50% of the time, meaning they become agitated, they don't eat the food. So that's the irrational part of the response, according to economists. They don't eat the food, they refuse to perform. And if we give the grape to the other guy without any task involved, they reject 80% of the time. So they're sensitive to effort, and effort is part of human sense of fairness. So for example, if I have a salary that is twice your salary for exactly the same job, that is highly unfair unless I work every weekend and every night and you're sort of lazy, you know. So in that case, we think it's actually fair. So effort is part of the human equation of fairness. I'm going to show you a little video. We recently re-videotaped the experiment because we thought we're going to use fresh monkeys who've never done this before. Because we have monkeys who have become sort of blasé about this task. They've done this so many times. So we took monkeys who had never done it. And you're going to see a test where the one on the left gets cucumber, the one on the right gets a grape. The first piece of cucumber is still accepted and eaten. So it's not that the presence of grapes, because the grapes are visible, sort of turns them off. Now, the first piece of cucumber is still fine. You will see what happens with the second piece. So this one returns a rock to our hand, gets a piece of cucumber, eats it. Now the one on the right needs to find a rock. There we go, gives it to us, gets a grape for it. The one on the left sees that. The one on the left now returns a rock, gets a piece of cucumber. Gets a grape. Now this one is going to test the rock. The rock is maybe not good. There we go, yeah. Gets a piece of cucumber again. So this is the Wall Street protest right here. The funny thing is, when we published this, it got a lot of attention, because there's always some amount of unfairness in society that can be connected to it. And so it got an enormous amount of attention. But there was one group of people who was really sort of pissed off at the experiment. These were the philosophers. We got even one letter from a philosopher who said, monkeys cannot have a sense of fairness because fairness was discovered during the French Revolution. So, and there was another one who wrote a piece where he said, well, he would believe it had something to do with fairness if the one who receives the grape refuses the grape or gives the grape to the partner. Now the interesting thing is that the monkeys never do that. But Sarah has been testing chimpanzees extensively, and she has some combinations, not all of them, some combinations of chimpanzees where the one who gets the grape refuses the grape until the other one also gets a grape. So we're getting very close to the human sense of fairness. And we think actually this whole mechanism, this reaction which is very emotional, as you see. So that's why I'm showing the video instead of just the data, because it's a very emotional response, just as it is with humans. That this reaction relates to cooperation. If you live in a cooperative society, and certainly these monkeys do, they hunt cooperatively and do all sorts of things cooperatively. If you live in a cooperative society, you have to be sensitive to what you invest in the cooperation that you get out of it also. And so you have to compare what you get. If I'm always cooperating with you on a hunt, for example, and you always take most of the meat, 90% of the meat, and I get a little piece, that's not a particularly good partnership for me. I need to be sensitive to that. And so it has recently been found in dogs. My prediction would be it will not be found in cats, which are solitary hunters. And so you're going to find it in animals who normally cooperate. And it's probably a very widespread response. And so philosophers, yeah, they will have to rethink their philosophy about fairness. It's maybe much simpler than what they think it is. So finally, I'm going to tell you something about bonobos, which I think is a very interesting species to know about. The species is exactly equally close to us as the chimpanzee, actually maybe slightly closer to us, that's the thinking. It's a very cute primate. They all have the same hairstyle, as you see. And they have a flatter face. It's, the eyebrow ridges are less pronounced than in the chimpanzee. And their body build is more human-like also than in the chimpanzee. So especially when they stand upright, you can see that. They have longer legs. And actually, Adrienne Zilman, an anthropologist, has compared them with Australopithecus. And of all the living apes, the bonobo is closer to the general body scheme of Australopithecus. And recently, discovery of Ardipithecus, I don't know if you know about Ardipithecus, was discovered as a 4.4 million year old fossil. Ardipithecus looks exactly like a bonobo to me. And so the bonobo is, in terms of anatomy, maybe more similar to, and there's of course some differences with us. So can you see the differences? What are the differences? They have hair all over the body. You don't have that. And you can try that tonight in front of the mirror in the bathroom. Can you reach below your knees with your hands when you stand up? If you can, you should call me. And the feet are arboreal primate feet. Our feet are very different from that. So yes, there are differences, but the overall body scheme is very similar. We study them at the moment in Kinshasa, where there's a sanctuary where they receive these orphan bonobos that they confiscate at the market basically, and they raise them and then they release them in this forest here near Kinshasa. And they live there, and as you see, some of them have their own babies now, so they reproduce in that forest, and this thing exists already quite a while. And they live in a group life. So Zana Clay is my postdoc who does the work there. Because we can get much closer to these. Bonobo is a very hard animal to study in the field. And we can get much closer to these and collect information on them. So first thing I'm going to show you is bonobo sex. This is actually GG rubbing, as it's called, genital rubbing between females. Bonobos have sex in all combinations. There's only one combination is suppressed, is mother-son. It's interesting because sons stay in the group where their mothers live and are very dependent on their mothers all their life, but have no sex with their moms. That's the only combination that doesn't occur. But female sex is very common and relates to female bonding. And I'm going to show you in this little video, the first part, you will see an individual who masturbates another. Well, that's very few animals. I don't actually know any animal. It relates to the empathy level of bonobos, I think, is who gives sexual pleasure to another without having any sexual pleasure themselves. And bonobos do that kind of thing all the time. So this is a female who masturbates a male with her foot. It's all very brief. It's usually very casual, the sex in bonobos. Now a little mount here. He keeps eating. Now she's going to do GG rubbing on him. So this is not a copulation. She's doing what females normally do with females on a male. They're both screaming. There's a lot of vocalization usually. Now there's another female approaching with a baby. That female is going to have sex with the other. That's GG rubbing. Look at the facial expressions also. Also very brief. Females have a very big clitoris also in the bonobo. He's rubbing now on that little baby there, stimulating sort of. So that's just a little impression of bonobo sexual activity, which is very common, and which is used for all sorts of social purposes. So yes, sex is of course also used for reproduction, otherwise there wouldn't be any bonobos left. So it has reproductive functions, but I would say 3/4 of the sex that goes on in the bonobo society has nothing to do with reproduction and has to do with bonding and affiliation and reconciliation and tolerance and so on. And as you see, it's all very brief. These are not very long interactions. This is a female who's bottle feeding 2 juveniles, one of which is her own son. And again, I find this kind of scenes, we see so many of this kind of stuff, but this sort of illustrative, related to the empathy of the bonobo in the sense that she adjusts the feeding to the swallowing capacity, so to speak, as people do with bottle feeding babies. And she doesn't need to do this at all. And there's plenty of water around, so they don't need to drink from the bottle. There's a river right next to them. And so now she does the other juvenile. And we're trying to figure out why she is doing this, because she does that quite regularly. And since these bonobos are orphaned and end up in a sanctuary where for the first 2 or 3 years they're taken care of by women, called in French mamans. So the mamans raise them on the bottle, basically. It seems to us that she's reenacting, basically, her past, which happened like 12 years before, when she was raised on the bottle. But again, I've never seen in other primates or other animals a sort of tendency to do this sort of thing, and I think bonobos are really special in that regard. So bonobos are marked by female dominance. There's a recent brain study, the most empathic brain. So there's a recent study that compared the brains of chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans. And bonobo brain is more similar to the human brain in areas related to affection. It's certainly the sexiest ape. And then recently, a DNA study, and this is a bit surprising because many anthropologists prefer the chimpanzee as model of human ancestry. And have always sort of marginalized the bonobo. Because the bonobo is not aggressive enough. So they prefer scenarios where humans became the pinnacle of evolution through aggression and warfare. And the bonobo doesn't fit that thinking at all, because the bonobo is extremely peaceful. And actually, there's never been lethal aggression reported for bonobos either in the field or in captivity, whereas for chimps we have plenty of examples. And so the bonobo is problematic in the scenarios, and the bonobo is usually sort of left to the side. But now this DNA study says that the DNA difference between human and bonobo is 12% smaller than between human and chimp. And if that's true, all these scenarios, basically you can throw them out of the window, and probably the bonobo, together with Ardipithecus, are better models of what the ancestor was like. And Ardipithecus, as you may remember, if you follow that literature, has been described as a peaceful ape, because Ardipithecus had reduced canine teeth, just like the bonobo. So that's my little spiel on the bonobo. These are two playing bonobos. It's a very playful species in addition. It's the only primate species that I know where adult females play a lot. So in chimps, the adult males will play, but the females don't. In bonobos, both sexes play an enormous amount. And I thank all the people who work with me in all these projects, and I thank you. Yeah, so if anyone has questions, there's a microphone here in the middle. Would be best to walk up to the microphone.
Hi. It was fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Exactly what we wanted at this conference. It was a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask a question about thinking about the culture of apes. So that, as you know, a common question among humans is, are what you seeing a result of nature or nurture, or culture versus nature? And it seems like what we do, at least those of us who are not primatologists, when we look at apes, we think we must be seeing nature. So I'm curious for you to reflect on how much are we actually seeing culture as well as nature, obviously not one being exclusive of the other, and thinking particularly, of course, you know I'm going to pick up on the gender difference thing in particular. Is there a part that could be also explained through the culture of bonobos or apes, et cetera?
Yeah, so if you have a species like, let's say, a chimpanzee who's adult when they're 16, or an elephant who's even takes a much longer time than an elephant. Elephant development is actually slower than human development. If you get species like that, there's an enormous amount of learning that goes into their behavior. So a chimpanzee is never sort of a pure instinctual creature, because it's all affected by the surroundings. So for example, these bonobos that I just showed, they're very much affected by their orphan status. So they were not raised by female bonobos, they were raised by humans, and that has an enormous effect. And we have actually noticed in the conservation studies that we do on them is that the empathy level of bonobos raised by their own mothers is much higher than of orphaned bonobos. And so they're emotionally more stable, so to speak, and more regulated than the orphaned bonobos who have lost their mother due to violence. And I've done experiments on this kind of issue. I've done experiments, for example, where I raised juveniles of two macaque species together, where one macaque species is very conciliatory, and the other one, rhesus monkeys, they're very non-conciliatory. They're very hierarchical and aggressive, and they don't reconcile very easily. And if you raise them together, you completely transform the behavior of the rhesus monkeys, who become much more conciliatory as a result of exposure to the other species. And so in all these animals, the problem is exactly the same, in my opinion, as in humans, is that you cannot really tease apart what is nature and what is environment. And then the cultural part, which we use for humans, of course, when we speak of environment, we often call that culture. A lot of the environment I don't think has an enormous amount to do with culture, but we have cultural differences also in the primates. And so chimpanzees have a lot of cultural traditions. And I've not described it here, but we've done a lot of experiments on imitation, for example, in chimpanzees, how they learn from others, and how they follow, for example, high-ranking models more than low-ranking models. We've tested that out. And so all these effects occur also in other species than us. So there is no pure nature, just you can keep looking for it. But
No, I think we just commonly, when we don't do this research, I think we commonly just see it as somehow flat nature.
No, it really isn't, I think.
I wonder if you have any thoughts about Steven Pinker's recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which describes how violence in human societies has declined steeply over the last 500 years. And he ties a lot of it to empathy and how human societies have become a lot more empathic in the last several centuries. For example, hundreds of years ago, people used to regard torture and execution as public entertainments. I wonder what you think of that thesis, if you're familiar with it, and what you think of that in terms of the implications for your work.
Yeah, I'm somewhat familiar with it. I think it's possible that there's been a decline in violence over the last 500 years. I would have a lot of questions about it, though, because there's an enormous amount of structural violence. So, for example, in the US has 5% of the world population and has 25% of the prison population. So a lot of people are locked up in prison, enormous amount of people actually. It's much higher than in any other country that I know, which is structural violence in my opinion. So I have a bit of trouble of looking just at how many people die due to violence. If in the Middle Ages I got a knife in my back, I would probably die because there were no antibiotics, and now I would probably go to the emergency room and might survive. And so I have trouble understanding the exact statistics of reduced violence rate, so to speak. And I have even more trouble with the earlier part, because the sort of thinking behind it is that we started out having enormous amounts of warfare and violence, and that over time it became less and less. But the actual evidence for warfare in humans goes back only 12,000 years. So archaeologists say that there's no evidence from before the agricultural revolution that humans engaged in warfare. I'm pretty sure that they did a little bit, maybe like hunter-gatherers do today. But hunter-gatherers today, which is really the lifestyle our ancestors probably had, do very little warfare. And so that part of the thesis I have most problems with is the idea that we started out as a hyper-aggressive species. If we started out more like what I think, like bonobos, for example, there's no way that we're hyper-aggressive. And so there's a lot of questions, and anthropologists at the moment are all writing articles against the book of Pinker. I know that that's all in the pipeline. And so there's going to be a lot of critiques of the data that he has used and how he has evaluated the data. Even though I think probably for the last 500 years, he's probably on target with that.
So this question is also in reference to another work, which is the Wilson et al. Paper on the relevance of inclusive fitness to explain cooperation and altruism. And I'm wondering if your work on bonobos and chimps has something to add to that argument.
Yeah, the inclusive fitness question is, of course, basically a kinship question. Is cooperation regulated by kinship mainly? It used to be thought, so that in the literature of anthropologists like Boyd and Richardson and economists like Fear, they, in order to set human cooperation apart from animal cooperation, they've had followed different tacks. And one of them was to describe chimpanzee society and primate society in general as regulated mostly by inclusive fitness, which is sort of kinship-based cooperation. So basically they were saying like, chimps are like social insects, they're regulated by kinship, and that's all they do. Now everyone who works with chimps knows that that's not the case. The field workers have been saying that for 20 years, and I've been saying that for 20 years, is that there's an enormous amount of cooperation going on that has nothing to do with kinship. But it was very hard to convince them until 2 years ago. A group led by John Mitani from the University of Michigan started collecting feces in the forest of chimpanzees so that they could do DNA tests on the chimpanzee males. And so they demonstrated with their DNA tests that an enormous amount of the cooperative relationships, the majority in fact, is between males who are not related to each other or very distantly related to each other. So I would say that chimpanzee cooperation is mainly regulated by reciprocity, and kinship is largely irrelevant, in fact, to it. So that's my thinking on that. But people have tried to make that reduction, yeah. And bonobos, I should add, bonobo females collectively dominate males. They don't individually dominate males. So if in a zoo, for example, you have in a zoo one male and one female in an enclosure, the male is dominant. The male is bigger, stronger, bigger teeth. But as soon as you put two females and a male together, the females dominate. So it's a collective dominance that the females have. And female bonobos are not related in a community. So in the wild communities, it's the females who are migratory, who travel from group to group. The males stay always in the same group. And so the females who you find in a community are genetically not related, but they're highly cooperative. And so again, for bonobos also, there's a lot of non-relative who cooperate.
Thank you. If I could add one more question, which is there incidents of adolescent sterility, or where they stay around and care for their siblings rather than move off in both bonobos and chimps? Is that similarly practiced? Yeah, there's of course many birds where young individuals help their parents raise offspring, and so there's that kind of breeding care. But that really doesn't apply to bonobos and chimps, because the females at puberty leave the group. And so that's actually a characteristic that we humans, one of the many that we share with the great apes, is that in many monkeys it's the males who leave the group and the females stay behind. In the apes and humans, it's more a female tendency to leave the group and marry someone outside. That's what humans do. And in bonobos and chimps at puberty, the females leave. So they're really not much involved in care at all for the offspring of their mom. Thank you.
Yes, I'm wondering if in this in-migration of females, if there are connubia, that is mate transfers among related communities, the way we find in humans, where either the females move out or the males move out to another community. So if there is a connubium, then it's highly likely that a number of the females who move in are in fact related.
What do you mean? Did they exchange that on purpose or something?
No. If you have troops living within a same area, I mean, it stands to reason that a female is going to move to a neighboring troop rather than one that's many miles distant. So if you have fairly stable troops within a territory, then the receiving troop would be getting females from neighboring troops, so that the in-migrating females, at least some of them, would come from the same natal troop. Yeah.
So that's likely. I think that happens. Actually, the bonobo is far less territorial than the chimpanzee. So the chimpanzee, there's no chimpanzee communities that I know where there's friendly relationships between communities. And so the chimpanzee males, they kill each other between communities, just like human males sometimes do. And for bonobos, we know that they mingle. So bonobo troops meet at the border. They yell at each other, so to speak. And then very soon the females have sex with females on the other side, or with the males on the other side. And very soon it looks more like a picnic than like a war, because they're sitting around grooming and their kids are playing and so on. And so that's called mingling. Now, if you get this kind of mingling, and it involves sex automatically with the bonobos, that means that there's going to be some fertilizations going around between communities, which means automatically that if males of this community meet males of that community, there's going to be some brothers or some relatives in there, even though they don't know about that. But from an evolutionary perspective, it is detrimental to start killing off these males because there may be some relatives of you among them. And so my thinking is that since bonobos do this mingling, this is one of the reasons maybe that there's less warfare, sort of cyclical evolution of reduced warfare between them. And the same thing that you mentioned, yeah, you get a slightly, but the chances are, because each community is surrounded by many others, but you get a slightly higher percentage of females who are probably related to each other.
Hi, I'm really a fan of your work for a long time, and I'm curious about, I grew up with two brothers who liked to wrestle, but then would fight, and I would try to break it up unsuccessfully, but I'm just interested in how you think about conflict among, you talked a little bit about children working out conflict when people don't interfere, and just for if you have any observations related to this idea of wrestling or working out physically contact between children when they're younger.
Yes, very interesting question. I'm from a family of 6 boys. And so I always feel that when I was a student and started studying aggressive behavior, because Lawrence was very important in stimulating studies of aggressive behavior in humans and animals, people presented aggression always as a problem. And I always thought, well, what's the problem? I didn't see really what the problem was. If aggression leads to violence, it is a big problem. But there's a lot of aggression that I think happens and that is patched up afterwards, which is perfectly fine. And that happens in a primate group all the time. And so my interest in reconciliation was probably related to that. And there's a lot of testing going on among young individuals of strengths and skills and things like that. And we've done a study one time which was a bit related to the empathy issue, because one of the questions was if a large individual, let's say a 5-year-old chimp, plays with a 2-year-old chimp, the 2-year-old is at such a great disadvantage. Does the 5-year-old know that and adapt to it? And they do. They play far more gently with a 2-year-old than with another 5-year-old, where they go all out and see how hard they can pull and how hard they can bite before the other one screams or something like that. And if the other one screams, then of course immediately a mother comes over and everything is sort of in a mess at that moment. And so in that study, a very interesting aspect of that study is not related to your question, but what we found is if an older juvenile plays with an infant, like a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, which is really very vulnerable, when they play with that, they have a lot more laughing expression, because chimpanzees laugh when they play. They have a laughing sound and a laughing face. They do a lot more of that if the mother of the baby is watching. So we looked at, is the mother nearby or is the mother far away? If the mother is nearby, they do a lot of this laughing expression, probably to indicate to mom, everything is fine, we're just having fun. And if the mom is not nearby, they go a little bit harder at the infant and see what they can do with it. So it's for sort of interesting calibration going on.
I have 2 questions. First, are any of your videos available for teaching purposes that we could download? And then the second is, can you talk a little bit about parent-child discipline in the societies? And I do physical discipline research myself. Is there any evidence that juveniles disciplined in a more physical way versus less physical way are less adjusted? These kinds of questions.
So what with regard to the videos, there's a lot of videos that I use that are either not mine or are not for public distribution. But I have a TED talk that if you look for TEDx or TED, you're going to find, and in which some of these videos are included. And so that's a 20-minute lecture or something that you can find on the internet. As far as discipline is concerned, physical discipline is extremely unusual in, let's say, the chimpanzee or the bonobo. And I've always been astonished by a female chimpanzee will have a 3-year-old baby who's doing all sorts of terrible things and jumping on her head and whatever. Everything is tolerated. And the main strategy of many primate females, if their offspring does something they don't want them to do, like walk up to a dominant male who's potentially in a bad mood or something like that, or taking food away from a dominant who may not accept that, the main strategy is distraction. So until the child is 4 about, and that's also the weaning age where they wean them, until that age, they mainly work on the principle of distraction, moving them away, putting them in another situation, and hoping that what they wanted to do goes over. So physical punishment, and in elephants, physical punishment is also extremely unusual. Now, over the age of 4, for a chimpanzee, then everything starts to change. First of all, young males are going to be punished by adult males if they hang around, for example, sexually attractive females. The adult males, up to that point, accepted almost anything from these kids, but after the age of 4, there's going to be coming a day where they lift them up and bite them deep into the arm, or whatever they do, swing them around, and make such a deep impression on them that from that moment on, these young males are very scared of estrus females and stay away from them, because they have learned that that's something they cannot do anymore. And so they get taught, but usually not by the mom, they get taught by others what sort of the boundaries of their behavior are. And elephants, I think that's probably at a later moment that comes. So physical punishment, I must say, is very unusual. There's some species like macaques where the females do it a bit more often, but our closest relations, chimps and bonobos, do almost none of it.
In response to the kinship question you had talked about the non-specificity by which help and aid is given. But in humans, we can sort of manipulate the extent to which they're going to prefer group or not by certain conditions, if they're under threat, or if we distribute resources according to group membership and so on. So can you create conditions, or primates responsive to certain kinds of environmental conditions that will enhance, say, kinship preference or other kinds of band preference or group preference under conditions of threat or distribution of resources and so on? So.
Well, I think if primates have a common enemy, this is of course also the easiest way to get harmony in a human society, and politicians know that, is to have an external enemy, because then you immediately aggregate around the leader. And I think for primates this is probably the same, probably works the same, but no one has done systematic experiments on this. And that would be very hard to do, because you would have to set up some sort of competition between groups of primates, which is really not something that I in captivity would want to do. And I don't think in the field that's easily done. But I think that same mechanism operates as if you have a common enemy. That is probably the surest way to get group harmony, intra-group harmony.
So before we conclude, I just have a very quick practical announcement. For each of the mornings of this conference, we have scheduled 3 keynotes for reserved times. And one of the reasons is that the Society's meetings keep getting larger and larger, and we would like to have some time where we as a community in part can come together. And so this obviously was one wonderful example of such an opportunity for us to come together. But I would like for you also to consider to come to tomorrow's keynote, which is being given by the renowned Turkish psychologist Jikdem Kashitsibas. And so I'd very much encourage you to come and tell others about that as well. It's really an opportunity for all of us to meet, to share these questions, and to think together about some of the common ideas that we have. So what I'd like to do now is end with a big thank you to Frans de Waal. It was... That was quick. What I'd actually like to do is to kind of end in the spirit of this conference, and also in a sort of tribute to this wonderful presentation that we had, which is to end in Dutch. So, dankjewel.